Alright, so in this video we're going to be recreating the Van Halen jump brass stab synthesizer sound. This is one of the most iconic synthesizer sounds basically of all time. It's one that generations of people instantly recognize when you hear those first few chords. And I realize this is a sound that's been recreated on virtually every synthesizer since the 1980s. But what we're going to do here is we're going to take it a little step further and get into some more advanced modulation techniques that you can do within the Prophet Rev2 synthesizer and other modern polysynths. So it's not going to be just about creating the jump patch, but also getting into the topic of really creating a virtual classic polysynth. We're going to virtually model an OBXA within the constraints of the Rev2 synthesizer. All right, right here I have my Prophet Rev2 editor. I have my Prophet up in the rack over here, and I just have a basic program, an initialized program here. Okay, so it's just a sawtooth right here. So for this brass stab sound, what we're going to do is we're going to mix a sawtooth and a square. So I'm going to turn on the square wave here. So right now it's just a pulse since we have a shape mod at 0. Okay, so now we have this pulse wave in here, this square wave, and now I'm going to mix these two together. For that sort of rumbling, bassy sound on the jump patch, I'm going to mix it so that there's a bit more of the square wave in here than the sawtooth. Okay, so that's a good basis for that type of sound. All right, now let's jump over to the amplifier and low pass filter and just start blocking out the envelopes for this. So for this type of stab sound, we're going to want quick attacks on both. I'm going to leave the attack for the amplifier actually at 0 right now. I'm going to pull up the decay and pull down the sustain just to shape out a curve here for the amplifier envelope. And we want a pretty quick release too for this type of stab sound. So I think that's okay. I'm going to leave the envelope amount at 127 at full right now for the amplifier. I may come back and adjust these settings later. For the low pass filter, we also want a snappy curve here. I'm going to give it a little bit of attack. And then for decay, I'm going to set this actually really long and 0 sustain and pretty quick release here too. And then for the cutoff, I'm going to pull the cutoff way down here. Also, we want a 2-pull filter for this jump sound. So I'm going to turn on 2-pull filter by clicking this off. I'm going to turn key tracking on. So key tracking amount of 64 means that each consecutive key press advances by 1 semitone. So it means the filter is perfectly key tracked if you set this to 64. Okay, and now I'm going to just pull up the envelope amount until it sounds about right here. So yeah, somewhere around there. That sounds pretty good. Let me bring this up just a little further here. Okay, yeah, I think that's pretty good for blocking. Might actually add a little bit of resonance in here too on the 2-pull. A little more. Okay. All right, well, yeah, I think that's good for blocking for the sound for now. We can always come back later and make adjustments to this. So yeah, at this point, we basically got, as far as some synthesizers would go in recreating this sound, we've got a playable jump sound here. All right. So at this point, we'll jump off and get started on some of the advanced modulation techniques. So the first thing we're going to do here in our attempt to recreate an OBXA within the Prophet Rev2 is we're going to try to replicate this tuning offset table. So a few months back, I set out and I took recordings from a ton of old vintage polysynths including multiple OBX and OBXAs, SEM 4-voice, Yamaha CS80s, memory Moogs, Prophets, basically all the big classic polysynths. And I recorded and took voice-by-voice measurements and built these tables of offsets for measuring how oscillator frequency changes on a voice-by-voice basis within all these classic polysynths, and how that is altered over multiple octaves as well as you move up the keyboard. And so most classic polysynths, in fact, all of them, exhibit behaviors similar to this. This is specifically for the latest OBX that I measured. And what you see here is the frequencies per voice have different offsets. And as you go up the keyboard, they're getting more flat relative to the target pitch of each given key. So there's this sort of intonation offset going up the keyboard. And in addition to that, on a voice by voice basis, it's offset. So what we want to do is try to recreate this behavior within the Prophet Rev2 to get the sort of natural phasing and natural detuning that you would get if you sat down at an actual OBX or OBXA. All right, so also, just real quick, if you're interested in reading up more on this topic of voice modeling, I set up this website at voicecomponentmodeling.com, and I wrote up this extensive article here that goes really into depth into the findings that I made for all these classic polysynths that I took all these measurements from, and how voice by voice offsets can get you a lot of that character of a classic polysynth, setting offsets to oscillator fine tuning per oscillator per voice, to envelope amounts, and to various other characteristics in the VCA and VCF circuitry. So yeah, I encourage you to check out this article if you want to read up more on this. But for now, let's jump in here and start doing some voice modeling. So the way to do this within the Prophet Rev2 is we're going to use the gated sequencer and the modulation matrix to build a model of the OBXA. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn on the gated sequencer and click the edit to get into the edit menu here. And so the gated sequencer has 4 lanes of data here, 1, 2, 3, 4. What we're going to do is we're going to build a virtual 8-voice polysynth within the Rev2. The OBX and the OBXA were 8-voice synthesizers. So what I'm going to do here first is set a reset at step number 9 on all 4 of these lanes. So now we have 8 steps, and then a reset on step 9 back to the beginning. So this is how we're going to create a virtual 8 voices within the Prophet Rev2. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn this sequence mode onto key stepping mode. And what key step mode means is that each time I hit a key, it's going to take a value from one of these steps and then advance to the next step. So this is how we're creating this virtual voice allocation model within the Rev2. And so what I intend to do with these 4 lanes is map 4 different characteristics and build a sort of lookup table for offsets for a virtual OBX synthesizer. So the first 2 lanes I'm going to map to oscillator 1 frequency and oscillator 2 frequency, but I'm not going to do it directly here because you get too coarse of values if you directly route it through the gated sequencer. Instead, what we're going to do is route it through the modulation matrix. So real quick, I'm just going to block out some values here. This and this. Okay. All right, so this is what we'll use here in a second in the modulation matrix. Okay, so to get this sort of tuning offset where there's a tendency for the keys to get more flat as you go up the keyboard range, what we're going to do is we're going to use the Note Number Modulator. So I'm going to set up a Note Number Modulator here for this, and set one of them going to oscillator 1 frequency and one going to oscillator 2 frequency. Now, if we directly routed this and just even set this to -1 right here, what we would have now is that the whole keyboard now is going to get more flat as we go up the keyboard. So if I get up here at this high A here, so you'll see down here in my tuner, it's 38 cents flat, so it's very flat. We don't want it to be that flat, but we're going to do this sort of scaling technique using the modulation matrix. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take sequence track 1 from the gated sequencer and sequence track 2 from the gated sequencer and route them down to these two lanes. So mod amount 5, so this is the 5th mod slot. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to route gated sequencer lane number 1 to this mod slot, and lane number 2 in the gated sequencer to this mod slot here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set these both to -1. And what this is going to do is it's not even going to pass on a -1 to this modulation amount. It's going to be a fraction of -1. And that fraction is going to be based on whatever is in these key steps divided by the total number of steps, the total value that you could possibly have. So there's 125 possible steps here. So if you take like this step with 65 divided by 125, you're going to get somewhere around 0.5 something is the fraction that you get on this lane. So at this point now, what I've done is I've effectively set up a intonation offset. So now I'm just going to hit this high A key a few times and just watch the tuner down here and see. So as you can see there, as I cycle through the 8 virtual voices, they're all offset somewhere between like about 17 cents and about 24 cents or so flat up there. If I come down here to this low C here, down at the bottom of the keyboard, it's between -6 and -10 cents or so. So what we've done now is we've created on a voice-by-voice basis, we have this intonation offset where the keyboard is has a tendency to get more flat relative to the target pitch of the key, and it's unique on a per-voice basis. And this is exactly what I measured on the OBX and OBXAs that I tested, as well as many of the other classic polysynths that I tested. So this is a very realistic type of behavior. So one other thing we're going to do here is I'm going to pull up the fine tune right here to about 15 or 16, just because I don't want the whole keyboard to be flat. I want somewhere in the middle of the keyboard to be basically in tune. And then it's the bottom of the keyboard will be a little bit sharp for each key, and up here it'll still be a little bit flat. So I just want to sort of center the offset here. So here, let me just hit these keys like an A in the middle of the keyboard here. So yeah, the middle of the keyboard is closest to being in tune, somewhere between a couple cents flat and right in tune. And then if I go down to the bottom of the keyboard, so it's slightly sharp down there, and slightly flat up at the top. And the maximum range for the whole keyboard is less than 20 cents or so for the maximum range. So it's not a huge amount of detuning, and it's sort of it's organized on a voice-by-voice basis. As you noted, you probably saw, I'm sort of grouping these together. So there's not too far apart between the two oscillators in any given voice. So there is some natural phasing and detuning going on in each voice as I hit just a single key, but it's not a ridiculously high amount on a per voice basis. But added up, when you play a chord, it has a lot of natural detuning and phasing that you would get with an actual OBX or OBXA. So let me just play this just so you can hear what this sounds like. So as you can see there and hear, when I'm playing these chords, there's a lot of interesting detuning and phasing motion going on, which sort of softens the sound and gives a much more organic feel. All right, yeah, that sounds pretty good. So I'm pretty happy with the voice offsets here. The next thing I'm going to jump in and do is I'm going to use these other two lanes to map out some more behavior on a voice-by-voice basis. So we've got this sort of tuning table completed to mimic an old OBX or OBXA. I'm going to add some envelope variants here too. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to target all attack and all decay here. And there's literally dozens of different characteristics that you can target using this voice modeling technique. If you want to target different things in the VCF section, the VCA section, more complex macro type behaviors, I found that targeting the attack and decay times has a big effect because it offsets the cutoff curve, the temporal aspect of the cutoff curve. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to give a little bit of variance on a voice-by-voice basis to the attack speeds and decay speeds here. All right, that should be fine. Okay, so that's just going to add a little bit more organic behavior. So every time I hit a note, it's going to have a slightly different attack curve and decay curve as well. Okay, that sounds pretty good. So let's jump away from this. I may come back in a little bit and do some more alterations to the voice modeling, but let's leave that for now and just move on with the additional sound design for this. So one thing I want to do here is with this square wave, I want to have some shape modulation like that, where it's swinging this back and forth. So I'm going to jump in here and just assign one of these LFOs to Oscillator 2 shape. Oscillator 2 is the square wave. And I just want something fairly slow and with a little bit of amount here. Let's get some shape modulation. All right, that sounds pretty good. That gets us some of that rumbling, bassy sound. The next thing I want to do, I'm going to make this more of a stereo patch. So one way you can create stereo spread within the Rev2 is to use this pan spread amount in the amplifier. And if you pull this up, what it does is it alternates every other voice goes right or left, depending on the amount you set here. But instead of doing the alternating voice pan spread, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this entire layer A into layer B and pan each of the layers. So what we're going to do here is go, I'm just going to copy layer A and paste it into layer B. So now we have two identical copies with the same envelopes and every other aspect that we've already modeled here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stack these two layers, and I'm going to set the pan mode, instead of being alternate, I'm going to set it to fixed for both these layers. And now in the modulation matrix, I'm going to set a DC source to the VCA pan spread amount. So DC stands for direct current. It's just basically a way to directly inject a number into the modulation matrix. So we'll do this on both layers. And if you were to go -32, that would mean hard left panned. I'm not going to hard pan this fully. And then conversely, if it was +32, that would be hard right panned. I'm just going to pan these about halfway right and left. All right, yeah, that sounded pretty nice. So one other thing that I know the jump sound has in it is there's definitely some pitch modulation going on. So I'm going to set up one of these LFOs here to be relatively slow, and I'm going to do, I think I'm just going to target oscillator 1 frequency, the saw wave, for some pitch modulation, and bring this amount up here and see what this sounds like. Okay, I think what I want to do instead of directly routing the amount here is I'm going to use a note number modulator to do this instead. So when you do pitch modulation or shape modulation, larger shape modulation amounts, oftentimes if you equally apply it across the whole keyboard range, that the bass will start to get a little bit flubby and lose some of its control and some of its clarity. So I often will do this where I'll use a note number modulator when I'm setting amounts of pitch modulation or shape modulation. So I'm going to use a note number modulator, and I'm going to set this to LFO 2 amount, and I'm just going to route the number 2 into here. So what this is going to do is it's going to make it so in the bass notes, only about a quarter of this amount is going to be at the low C here, and about 3/4 of whatever I set here, this number 2, is going to be at the high end of the keyboard. So it's just going to scale down the amount of pitch modulation in the bass frequencies. Okay, so that sounds good. It still keeps the clarity in the bass now. Okay, that sounded pretty good. Now move that just down to a 1. And actually I need to do the same thing on this layer. Let's go to LFO 2 amount and just set this one the same. Okay, yeah, that sounds pretty good for some pitch modulation. So one thing I realized that we didn't do yet is, so after we copied this second layer in here, we didn't make any alterations to the second layer gated sequencer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to adjust these a little bit on this layer, so there's even more of an organic aspect to this, where each oscillator on each layer has its own offsets. So I'll create some really interesting sort of phasing, chorusing type of motion. And I'll adjust the pack and decay envelopes just a little bit too on this. We've already set on layer A, it already has voice by voice unique values, and this is just going to set layer B to have different ones. Okay. All right, that's good. Let's see what that sounds like. Okay, and we desperately need some reverb here. So the jump sound is sort of drenched in a delay or delay reverb type of setting. And actually, if you read about the jump sound, there's some varying accounts of exactly how they did it. But the one common thread is that it's been said that they actually played the synthesizer through an amplifier, like a guitar amplifier as well, and recorded that. So we're not going to get the exact match of the album necessarily, but we're getting pretty close here. But one thing it definitely has is a good amount of reverb. So I'm going to turn reverb on both of these layers and crank up the time a bit probably, and probably bring down the mix a bit too, because let's see what that sounds like. Sounds a little bit brittle here. I'm going to pull down the tone. Let's see here. On the tone a little bit more. Okay, that's sounding pretty good. I'm going to add some performance modulation, I think, at this point. So one thing I almost always do on all my patches is assign aftertouch pressure. I like to be able to dig in on the keys and get some vibrato usually. So what I'll do is I'll set this LFO number 1 to be a sort of vibrato. So for vibrato amounts for frequency, generally somewhere between 60 and 80 is a good vibrato amount for the frequency. And I'm going to set this to oscillator all frequency and do the same thing on this one. And I'll just match the frequency on both these layers. And then what I'm going to do is map pressure to LFO 1 amount. So that's this vibrato. And I'll just pull this up to maybe around 8 or so. And same thing on this layer. Okay, so similar to what I did with the Note Number Modulator for the pitch modulation here, and that I sometimes do for shape modulation, I'll often do this with the vibrato as well. I don't want that much vibrato happening on the bass frequencies, just because it loses some of the clarity in the bass and gets a little wobbly. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up another Note Number Modulator and send it to this vibrato LFO. So LFO 1. And do the same thing on this layer, LFO 1. And what I'm going to do is just leave this set to 0 as the amount. This modulation slot's just going to be an in-between variable for the pressure. So I'm going to route pressure now to this mod slot. So this is 1, 2, 3, mod slot 3. So mod 3 amount and mod 3 amount. So what this is going to do now is as I push down and give pressure on the keys, it's going to dynamically give less vibrato in the bass notes and more vibrato up here up the keyboard. And the ratio for this, for note number modulation, the rough estimate is that at the bottom of the keyboard, it's about 1/4 of whatever value you're sending it. And at the top of the keyboard, it's about 3/4 of the value that you send to it in standard octave range. So I'm going to pull this up to like 9 or so. Let's see what this sounds like. Okay, yeah, so now the bass is nice and clear. If I'm pushing down and adding pressure up here, since it's a channel aftertouch, it's not making the bass all flubby when I'm adding pressure up in the treble area here. So that sounded pretty good. Let me do a little playthrough here of the whole part here. All right, yeah, that sounded pretty close to the jump sound. So I think at this point, I'm going to wrap up the video here for now. What I'll do is I'm going to work on this patch a little more and maybe do some tone matching to the actual recordings. And what I'll do is I'll make this patch available. I'll save it and make it available. So anyone who's interested in getting this, just comment below or shoot me a message. And I'd be happy to send over the patch in SYX formats. If you have any other questions about this specific patch creation or about voice component modeling in general on the topic, feel free to comment below or send me a message and I'd be happy to help. And then also subscribe to this channel if you want to see more videos like this. I'm going to be doing a bunch more patch creation videos like this and some more stuff specific to voice component modeling with both the Prophet Rev2 synthesizer, and the Behringer DeepMind, and possibly some other digital synthesizers and VSTs. All right, that'll do it for now. Have a good one.